is Dave Rubin at Oxford University in London, right? Or is this in Oxford?
I think it's in Oxford, yep.
There you go. And speaking to some of those hard Scrabble folks in Oxford. And this guy is a fan of Dave Rubin's. They're all, I don't know if they're all fans, but this guy's a fan of Dave Rubin's. He's coming up and he wants to ask Dave Rubin a challenging question, right? And I know yesterday Michael played the Jordan Peterson clip with the
civil rights.
Jim
Jeffries.
Jim Jeffries, where he's asked one of the most fundamental questions you could ask someone like Peterson, as to, like a question that comes up in almost every debate that I have with a libertarian who calls in. And Jordan Peterson's construct is basically libertarian. I mean, I don't think he perceives it as his arguments as being economically founded, but the construct is the same. It is the world is fine as it is, and the imposition of government regulations to help people who are disenfranchised or less well situated than me is oppressive to me. I mean, that's basically his argument, right? And to people like me. And so here is Dave Rubin being asked a question from an ally, but taking on a sort of slightly contrarian for the sake of, the devil's advocate. And just like Jordan Peterson, who couldn't answer the most basic fundamental question that you would imagine, since he's been interviewed, a million times by Dave Rubin alone, would have had to have addressed that question. He couldn't do it. Dave Rubin does not seem to, maybe, I know people say he's just not up to the intellectual challenge here, but this is not that challenging of a question. But he doesn't seem to even know the slightest bit of what he's talking about. It is fascinating. Let's listen to this question and answer.
That type of progress isn't fast enough. And so nowadays in the politics of kind of getting things done and people vote for people who can get that affirmative action, that change done, how would you still kind of come back with your point about being local?
Yeah, well, the first thing I would do is, I hope some of you have seen this, I would send them to my video with Larry Elder.
All right, pause. So the question is that the guy says, and we get the question is like, do you think there's still systemic racism and people want to vote for people who would address that type of systemic racism and basically, give them the material benefits that they want?
Is, I hope some of you have seen this, I would send them to my video with Larry Elder, which I suspect some of you guys have seen. This is when I was still a lefty, and I asked Larry Elder, who happens to be black, he's a conservative, I asked him about systemic racism.
All right, pause it for 1 second. Let me just tell you Larry Elder is. He's a right-wing talk radio host out in California. And I used to listen to Larry Elder back when I worked in L.A., for brief periods of time. And totally follows the conservative script. I sat down with Larry Elder, had an opportunity to meet him at the Democratic Convention, 2004. And I remember, and I took what I was doing very seriously at the time. I was, had been a comedian and a director and a writer, and I had just taken the time off to deal with I thought maybe I'd probably end this by November of 2004. We started in April. And I remember Larry Elder sat down with Janine Garofalo and I, and he's like, and we just sort of like, we were off air. How do you do this? And he's like, come on, guys, we're off the field. And we're like, what? He's like, come on, we're off the field. We don't, no need to have game faces on. And we were just like, wait, what? Like, you think this is just a job to you?
Was that him, how he reacts generally, or just because he didn't want to get into it with you off mic?
I don't know, but he was almost surprised that we took it that seriously.
Sounds like Larry Elder doesn't take ideas seriously.
Maybe, I don't know, but Dave Rubin's really touting this. But so let's hear what he's got to say.
He basically beat me senseless. I mean, it is a violent video on YouTube. He beat me senseless with facts. Systemic racism, let me just talk about America here, so I'm not going to talk about the UK here. Systemic racism does not exist. There are no laws in America, meaning the system. Doesn't mean racism doesn't exist. Racism exists. There are people who are racist, and you should do everything you can to show them that their ideas are wrong, and that you should not be judging someone based on their race, of course. But the idea that there is systemic racism, meaning that there are laws in place that treat black people differently or Asian people differently or white people differently, simply doesn't exist.
Okay. Now, what Dave is showing here is that he doesn't know what the word systemic racism mean. I think it would be virtually impossible to find anybody who defines systemic racism as a function of laws. Systemic racism means that society is structured in such a way, that institutions behave in such a way that they prevent people of certain races from, or they disadvantage people from certain races because of their race. And not just because of their race in that moment, because they are descendants of people of a certain race, because their race has, in some respects, defined their circumstances. Now, it doesn't mean that they can't break out of it. Doesn't mean that but that largely speaking, the structures of society, the system, works against them. Not that there are laws. He's just simply either made that up or just so ignorant about it. I don't know. Or maybe just misremembers what Larry Elder told him. Or maybe that's why he got beat up by Larry Elder in that interview.
Maybe he got a concussion from that.
He wasn't that bright at the time or something. Something happened, but let's continue.
Or white people differently simply doesn't exist. Now, that doesn't mean that we can still do better on certain things. So for example, often black people will be incarcerated longer for simple crimes that if a white person committed won't be. Now that has to do more with socioeconomic reasoning, which is why I would be for, if you can get an economy that's as free as possible, you will have more and more people, regardless of the color of their skin, being able to partake in an economy.
Pause it. Okay, so if I'm to understand him, the reason why there are more black people incarcerated, can we just go back and listen to this again? Because he seems to be saying the reason why there's more people, black people incarcerated is because of socioeconomic reasons, and that if we had an economy that included everyone, then they wouldn't be forced. He doesn't say they wouldn't be forced to commit a crime, but that's the implication. So, and this is why this is so difficult. He at once is saying there's no systemic racism. But then he says that the economy does not include everybody, okay? And presumably those people are the black people that he's talking about who are disproportionately in jail. So he's both saying that there's more people in jail, black people in jail, because they can't participate in the economy, sort of saying like that they're forced into getting arrested for drug crimes at a higher rate, even though we all know white people have as much, if not more, the drugs than black people do. He's ignoring that aspect of it and then blaming on the fact that black people can't participate in the economy, which apparently to him is not a function of systemic racism. It's a function of somehow, I guess, an economy that just coincidentally left off the people who have been historically racially oppressed in this country. So let's just go back and listen to this, because this is his inability even to maintain his own internal logic for the course of a sentence and a half is almost artistic.
Differently simply doesn't exist. Now, that doesn't mean that we can still do better on certain things. So for example, often black people will be incarcerated longer for simple crimes that if a white person committed won't be. Now that has to do more with socioeconomic reasoning, which is why I would be...
How is it that if black people are committing the same crimes as white people, but they're incarcerated more, how is that socioeconomic? How is that not systemic racism? And even what does that mean it's socioeconomic?
Well, he is dumb, and I don't want to ascribe any kind of good analysis to him, But yes, if you want to go back to the beginning, the creation of race and racism, that arose from capitalism and wanting to make money off of human beings who were enslaved. But that's clearly not the argument he's making.
No, it's not. I don't know what it is he's making. Maybe he's arguing that because they can't, because that black people don't have the resources to get good lawyers that get them off.
They turn to crime. It's that whole thing. Like as a true libertarian, I would think you would say maybe, hey, are we policing these groups of people more vigilantly than other groups of people? For instance, that might explain.
But
certain
that would
crime
be
statistics.
systemic racism, wouldn't it?
That would be.
Yeah, I mean, but the thing is, he concedes that black people are not treated equally by the justice system in the first sentence. And then he says, but it's socioeconomic reasons, which it's almost impossible to know what he means by that, except for the only explanation later is that there are people who are systemically kept out of the economy, which would also be instructive of systemic or evidence of a systemic racism.
Because the problem with our economy is it's not libertarian enough right now.
Or if you can get an economy that's as free as possible, you will have more and more people, regardless of the color of their skin, being able to partake in an economy. But, it's so funny because this is where the Democrats have sort of owned a lot of the minority communities. And I think Candace Owens and Kanye, believe it or not, are the leaders out. I mean, I really think they are. But if you think about this, if you think about the worst places in the United States for black people to live in terms of economics, in terms of shootings, it's Chicago, it's Ferguson, it's Atlanta. It's these places that have been run by Democrats almost exclusively for 80 years. Yet the Democrats keep saying we're for black people. So it's sort of like saying I'm a progressive, I'm for a progressive. It sounds good. Well, I'm for black people. Everyone's for black, unless you're a true racist, you're for black people the same way you should be for everybody else. So they've tricked you into thinking, Chicago, I would guess, someone should check the numbers on this, but I'm going to guess about 50 to 80 people, black people, were shot in Chicago this past weekend. You never hear about
So pause
that.
it now for a second. So here he is. This is the guy who decries making everything political, right? Here he is trying to explain that there's no systemic racism, but somehow because Democrats have controlled, certainly not Ferguson, but in Chicago, and I don't know for how many years it's been Atlanta, there's certain attributes I think I associate with Georgia that may also indicate why there might be some long-term problems there. But that somehow that is indicative of why there's no systemic racism, because those cities which have been controlled, he says, by Democrats, nominally speaking, but proves there's no systemic racism.
Well, affirmative action, as the guy who asked the question mentioned in his question, someone should ask Dave Rubin if he considers that structural racism.
That if the actual, I think that British guy was not using affirmative action in the way that we use it.
Yeah, okay,
I think he was
enough.
just saying like actual action that is proactive in some way. But wait, is there more to this one? Or, yeah. Yeah. This is great now. Okay, so he goes through the sort of the tired analysis of Chicago. Is not there's a lot of murders in Chicago, therefore there's no systemic racism because that's controlled by Democrats, which of course makes absolutely no sense.
Democrats have sold out working class people of all different races,
Yes,
but
that's
it's not
fine, but
because
that's not
they
what we're
weren't
talking about,
neoliberal enough.
Right, exactly.
Mostly black on black crime. Well, if the Democrats are so good at fixing these problems, why is it that in their cities it's always the worst? And it's because they create these incentives that are actually disincentives. And if you give people things, it becomes very hard to not want those things anymore. And I can give you, I know that anecdotal stuff isn't always the best way, but I can give you one.
Pause it. First of all, it's not anecdotal, but whatever. I misspeak too. So now he's moved to trying to prove that the problem with a city like Chicago, controlled by Democrats, is that the reason why why there's such a high murder rate in Chicago is because people, when they get things, they don't want to give up these things, right now. So like, the idea is that there's been such goodies for black people in Chicago.
Got to protect the Obama phones.
That that there's a high murder rate. But let's see where he's going, because anecdotes aren't necessarily as good as data, but sometimes they can
Some qualitative texture.
yeah.
know that anecdotal stuff isn't always the best way, but I can give you one very good example. My sister lives on the Upper West Side of New York City. It's a nice area. She pays a ton to live in a nice area with a doorman building in New York City. A good portion of her building, I think it might be 50%, is rent subsidized, meaning that they're keeping rents low for certain people of certain ethnicities.
Let me explain this. To get certain zoning variances, buildings in this city sometimes, and I imagine that she's in one of these West Side, like far West Side buildings on the Upper West Side, right? Yeah, the Trump building, very possibly. To get the zoning variances, you're required to have some apartments in these buildings. It's usually not 50%, but whatever. Let's call it 50%. It's usually like 20 or 30%, whatever. That are rent stabilized, so that people who are either living in, well, it's not really, I wouldn't say living in poverty, but I would say lower income people relative to New York City have the opportunity to live in the building, because we don't want to drive too many people out. But go back a little bit, because you have to earn a maximum amount. Right? Like if I earn $150,000 a year, I'm not eligible for this one bedroom apartment because my income's too high. That is it. Dave perceives that there's something else going on with why you have these rent stabilized. Listen carefully, see if you can pick this up.
On the Upper West Side of New York City, it's a nice area. She pays a ton to live in a nice area with a doorman building in New York City. A good portion of her building, I think it might be 50%, is rent subsidized, meaning that they're keeping rents low for certain people of certain ethnicities to live there. To live in a very nice.
They're not keeping the money, the rents low for certain ethnicities. This is wholly made up in his mind. Okay? He has completely made up the idea that there's, now by ethnicities, I'm going to be generous, and he means the Italians, Greeks, the Polish, the Greeks, right? Certain ethnicities. That's why the rent is kept low. So here's a guy who's arguing there's no systemic racism and can't even get through this conversation without saying that they keep the rents low for blacks or Puerto Ricans.
Well, he means there's no systemic racism against people of color. Come on now.
That's right. Okay, so continue.
Rents low for certain people of certain ethnicities to live there, to live in a very nice area in a very nice building. Now imagine if that was you for a minute, and the guy next to you was paying $3,000 to live in the apartment, and you are paying $400. Would you ever not want that to be? You wouldn't. It's just the truth. You would, and then it gives you a disincentive to make more money, because once you make more money, they're going to take away your benefit.
Wait, we got to keep going, right? Oh, does it? He says he's going to move. So here he is saying that the problem with Chicago is that they're getting a benefit, that they're getting to live in a nicer place than they can afford because it's being subsidized by the state. Now, he could argue, I don't want to do that money, but he's saying it's like creating a disincentive for you to make more money. And then look where he goes with what this ultimately leads to in terms of this disincentive, right? Here it is. He goes and he says, this is going to be a problem with
mostly black on black crime. Well, if the Democrats
go
a little
forward. And so he's saying now that there's a disincentive for you to make more money. I don't know how this leads to the fact that there's not systemic racism. I don't know how we got from, is there systemic racism in this country, to my sister is oppressed because someone in her building is not paying $3,000 a month for an apartment.
Well, he believes in systemic racism against white people, I think.
Exactly. Here we go.
New York City. A good portion of her building, I think it might be 50%, is rent subsidized, meaning that they're keeping rents low for certain people of certain ethnicities to live there, to live in a very nice area in a very nice building. Now imagine if that was you for a minute, and the guy next to you was paying $3,000 to live in the apartment, and you are paying $400. Would you ever not want that to be? You wouldn't. It's just the truth. You would, and then it gives you a disincentive to make more money, because once you make more money, they're going to take away your benefit. And then what are you going to have to do? You're going to have to leave your nice area, and you're going to have to move 100 blocks north, if not out of the city altogether. So all of
So
this
wait a
is
second. So now he's arguing that the rent stabilization should not exist for these people, because if they make more money, just a little bit, they're going to lose their thing and they're going to have to move out of New York City, which is a horrible fate, apparently. So he's basically saying like only rich people should be able to live in New York City, and people aren't going to want to make more money. But if that's the case, then why is his sister? Why doesn't his sister just say, I'm going to make less money so I get the cheaper apartment? Because his sister might also want to go out to dinner. And his sister might have a kid and want to spend the $150 it's going to be for a babysitter to go out to dinner. Because it's better to be rich than to be poor, even with that subsidy.
And why is his solution to take away subsidized housing instead of just giving it to everyone?
Because
it's almost like he's got some ulterior agenda.
If you get subsidized housing, you're going to enjoy it. And then the murder rate will go up because you're of a certain ethnicity.
It's bizarre.
Where does he go? Wait, where does he just go after that?
Exactly where the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I don't believe these people are evil. I don't believe that the Democrats that put these, yes, some of them I think are evil and want to control people, but that's a small sliver. I think the average person who's voting for these policies, they think they're doing the right thing. And this is where I would say watch my interview with Larry Elder, and then especially watch my interview with the great Thomas Sowell, and read every book by Thomas Sowell, and understand that every time they have tried to make things better for specific people, they make it worse for everybody.
Pause it. Those rent stabilizations are not for specific people. They are not for any specific ethnicities.
Well, it's weird the way he's substituting race for class here, because I think that's the thing a lot of American dum-dums do, not limited to Dave Rubin, but like it's almost like a dark mirror. I don't want to compare him in any way to the left because he's an idiot. But like, it's almost like a dark mirror to like the class reductionists who think that if you can attack capitalism, that will solve racism and sexism for everyone. Only his solution is to make the economy even more neoliberal and laissez-faire. I
don't even think he goes that far.
Fix it.
I just think he thinks the problem is that we're giving the ethnicities, certain ethnicities, too many benefits, and they're getting so spoiled. That's what the problem is.
How do you think those conversations with his sister really went?
I mean,
these damn Croats next to me.
Yes.
I can't stand them.
all I do is I
Croat
smell
discount.
pasta all the time. I can't stand these eye ties.